The phone rang in the middle of the night. I was in Memphis, and at first, I thought it was just another late-night call from a friend or a prank. But when I picked up, the voice on the other end was serious and scared. "GK, it's Joe. You need to come quick. Something's happened to Elvis." My heart dropped. I knew something was wrong. I threw on some clothes and rushed out the door. By the time I got to Graceland, the house was in chaos. The Colonel, Elvis's manager, was barking orders, and the air was thick with tension. Elvis had fallen badly. The details were sketchy, but it was clear that things were not good. As I walked through the mansion, I could hear the whispers and the hushed conversations. The Colonel had gathered everyone in the living room and was laying down the law. He was angry, and his words were like a thunderstorm in the room. "Expenses are being cut. Anyone not pulling their weight is out. This is a business, and we can't afford distractions." The room was quiet, but I could feel the panic. Larry Geller, Elvis's spiritual advisor, had been the first to go. The Colonel saw his interest in spirituality as a threat to Elvis's focus. It was a power play, and a strong Elvis would have never stood for it. But this wasn't the same Elvis. He was hurt, frustrated, and seemed to have given up the fight. The next few days were a blur. The news of Elvis's fall spread like wildfire, and the media was buzzing. But amidst the chaos, a piece of news slipped through that brought a glimmer of hope. Elvis and Priscilla were getting married. It was a secret, and Elvis wanted to keep it that way. He called me personally to invite me to the wedding, which was to be held at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas. When the day came, I was flown from Memphis to Palm Springs to join Elvis and Priscilla. The wedding party was small, and the Colonel had made sure of that. He wanted tight control, and the ceremony was held in a small, crowded suite. It was a far cry from the grand event Elvis and Priscilla might have wished for, but it was their day and they were happy. The reception was even more controlled, with the Colonel's hand everywhere. Most of the Memphis Mafia guys were excluded, and it was clear that the Colonel was running the show. Red West, one of Elvis's closest friends, was furious and stormed out. The rest of us were left with mixed feelings, but we all tried to focus on Elvis and Priscilla's happiness. After the wedding, we spent a few days in Palm Springs with the newlyweds. It was a time of relaxation and joy, and the Circle G Ranch, where we often went, became a place of peace. Elvis and Priscilla were in love, and it was clear that their bond was more than just physical. They were best friends, and it was a beautiful thing to see. One night, as we were driving back to Graceland, Elvis stopped the car halfway up the driveway. "GK, you see that big house up there?" he asked, pointing to Graceland. "And this fancy car, and these diamonds." He held out his hand, showing off his rings. "Man, I sure hope it's not a dream." It was a moment of reflection, and I could see the weight of his fame on him. "It ain't no dream, Elvis," I reassured him. "Believe me, it ain't a dream." Elvis smiled, but I could tell he was still thinking about it. Despite the fame and the fortune, he was still just a man, and sometimes even he wondered if it was all real. The next few months were a mix of highs and lows. Elvis was preparing for his next movie, Speedway, and I went to L.A. to visit. The set was the usual mix of pranks and jokes, but it was clear that Elvis was capable of so much more. I decided to talk to the Colonel about it. "Colonel, why don't you let Elvis do something different? He could be a secret agent or do action movies like Steve McQueen or Paul Newman," I suggested. The Colonel's face darkened. "George, we don't give a shit. My boy's getting $1 million up front and 50% of the picture. None of those people get close to that, but my boy does." I tried to keep the conversation light. "But Colonel, couldn't Elvis get some better casts, better songs, better scripts?" "George, we don't give a shit about scripts. If we had to read the damn script, we'd charge them another $1 million. There are guys with Oscars who can't get arrested. My boy is getting $1 million up front, 50% of the picture, and top billing. That's all Hollywood cares about, making money. Elvis doesn't have to ask anybody out here for any favors." I knew it was a losing battle, but I couldn't help feeling frustrated. The Colonel was more interested in money than in Elvis's artistic growth. Despite the tension, the holiday season brought a sense of joy. Priscilla was pregnant, and the news made everything feel more magical. Elvis's generosity was on full display as he handed out checks to needy charities, and Graceland was transformed with 8 giant Christmas trees, each with its own color of lights. The driveway was lit up with blue lights, and the whole place looked like a winter wonderland. Christmas morning, Elvis was excited to open gifts. I had built him a rolling bookcase, a leather-covered cabinet on wheels, and he was thrilled. He stopped everything to test it out, rolling it around the first floor of Graceland with a stack of books. It was a small gesture, but it made him happy, and that was all that mattered. The next few days were filled with laughter and joy, but beneath it all, there was a sense of something changing. Elvis was still the king, but the world around him was shifting, and he was starting to realize it. The fall, the wedding, and the holidays, all of it, was a part of a bigger story, one that was just beginning to unfold. The Christmas Eve at Graceland was always special, but the late night drives were my favorite part. After the presents and the excitement, when most of the Memphis Mafia had gone home, it was just Elvis, Priscilla, Barbara, and me. We'd pile into a car and drive around Memphis, checking out all the Christmas lights and decorations. It was magical, and those moments are some of my fondest memories with Elvis. The Christmas spirit lasted all the way to New Year's Eve, and Alan Fortas and I were in charge of setting up a private party for Elvis at the Manhattan Club. Later on, we moved it to the Thunderbird Lounge and then to T.J.S., a club run by my friend Herbie O'Mell. But just a few weeks into 1968, things got even more exciting. On February 1st, Priscilla gave birth to Lisa Marie Presley. Elvis was a bundle of nerves all day, pacing around the hospital. When it was time to hold Lisa Marie, he looked at me and asked, "You want to hold her, GK?" I was terrified. No, Elvis, that's okay. I'm afraid I'll drop her. GK, you're going to hold her." He handed her to me before I could protest. It was a nice feeling to know that Elvis trusted me with his most precious treasure. But I could only hold her for a minute, before my nerves took over. "She's beautiful, Elvis, Priscilla, but you better take her back." They both laughed at my jitters, and Elvis quickly took her back. Watching them with their new baby, I saw how much in love they were, and how happy they were. Elvis was a family man now, and Graceland was a happy place. But outside those gates, the world was in turmoil. On April 4th, 1968, I was on the air at WHBQ when a news bulletin came in. Martin Luther King Jr. had been shot and killed at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. The city was in shock. A couple of days later, Herbie and I went to the Lorraine Motel. The place was eerily quiet, and we saw the spot where Dr. King had been standing. We even went to the building where the shooter had been and saw the window, and the handprint left behind. It was surreal to think that such a terrible thing had happened so close to home. Memphis erupted in riots and memorials. Beale Street was on fire, and a curfew was imposed. The city felt different, and I wondered if things would ever be the same. James Brown, one of my friends, was leading the way in a new, angrier kind of music. One day I used the word colored in conversation with him, and he corrected me. "George, we don't use that word no more. It's black now." I nodded, feeling a bit foolish. "But James, my mother always taught me to be nice and use the word colored." "I know, but times have changed. It's black now." I learned a lot from James that day. In the summer of 1968, Elvis started a project that would change his career. He was supposed to do a typical Christmas TV special, but he decided to get back to his rock and roll roots. Steve Binder, a young director, helped him do just that. The Colonel and Elvis had some creative battles, but Elvis was winning. I heard from Alan Fortas about the progress, and it sounded like Elvis was back in top form. Elvis flew to Arizona to film his next movie, Charo. When he came back to Memphis, we planned nights at Graceland and the Memphian, but there was also a sad event to prepare for. On September 28, 1968, Dewey Phillips, the DJ who had helped launch Elvis's career, died of heart failure. He was only 42. Dewey had become a street character in his later years, and his drinking had increased. Elvis and Sam Phillips had tried to help him, and Elvis often asked me to make sure Dewey had enough money, but he didn't want Dewey to know it was from him. At Dewey's funeral, Elvis and Alan were laughing, remembering the crazy phrases Dewey used to say. It was a bittersweet moment. On December 3, 1968, I was in my apartment in Memphis, glued to the TV. Elvis's TV special was on, and I was blown away. He looked lean and mean, and he was back to his rock and roll roots. The show was full of energy, from the opening song to the final performance. He sang If I Can Dream, a song of hope that was especially meaningful after a year of so much tragedy. By the end of the show, I was prouder of Elvis than ever before. He was back, and he was better than ever. In January 1969, Elvis walked into American Sound Studios in North Memphis. It was a humble place, but it had produced some of the biggest hits in the country. The studio was owned by Chips Moman, and the house band, the Memphis Boys, were some of the hottest musicians around. They all stood up when Elvis walked in, and he was ready to work. The chemistry was perfect, and it was clear that some great music was about to be made. Chips Moman opened American Sound Studio, and quickly assembled a group of top-notch musicians. Among them were guitarist Reggie Young, bassists Tommy Cogbill and Mike Leach, keyboardists Bobby Emmons and Bobby Wood, and drummer Gene Chrisman. He also hired a childhood friend of B.J. Thomas's, Mark James, as a staff songwriter. I often found myself scouting local bands for the talent party, and this led me to recommend the Gentrys to Chips. They ended up recording Keep on Dancing, which became a national top 5 hit in 1965. I started writing songs with Mark James. Even though I couldn't play an instrument or read music, my rhyming skills and experience as a DJ made me a useful co-lyricist. Mark and I wrote several songs, including Stone Cold Soul for Jackie DeShannon, Love Ain't Easy for Flash and the Board of Directors, and Sunshine and Roses and Love Street for Merrily Rush. Mark had also written hits like Eyes of a New York Woman and Hooked on a Feeling for B.J. Thomas. Elvis came to American Sound Studio to record, and I had spent a lot of time there. The studio had its quirks, like the occasional sound of rats in the ceiling during quiet songs. But the musicians, known as the Memphis Boys, had a group spirit similar to Elvis's Memphis Mafia. Once, after some of their cars were broken into, they decided to send a message. They caught a bunch of snakes, put them in a gift-wrapped box, and placed it in an unlocked car in the parking lot. When some thieves took the box, they quickly discovered the snakes and fled, making the parking lot pretty safe from then on. Chips was a no-nonsense guy who always told it like it was. He focused on getting great recordings and had little patience for anything that got in the way. Elvis appreciated this straightforward approach. The first song they recorded, Long Black Limousine, set a great working dynamic. Felton Jarvis, the RCA producer, was also there but understood that Chips was running the show. Elvis was back to his best, and the sessions were full of energy. The usual protocol for song selection was tossed aside, and Elvis got to work with some really strong material. Mac Davis wrote Memories, which Elvis loved, and Felton brought in more demos from him. Chips had access to songs from Mark James and other staff writers. Lamar Fike, who was now working with the publishing company, suggested Kentucky Rain by Eddie Rabbitt. Neil Diamond, who I knew from a previous session at American, had a song called And the Grass Won't Pay No Mind that he wanted Elvis to record. I played it for Elvis at Graceland, and he got excited about it. During the first night at the studio, we listened to demos, and one of the songs that caught everyone's attention was In the Ghetto. Elvis was moved by it and wanted to hold on to it. I initially thought it wasn't right for him, but after some reflection, I told Elvis it was perfect. He agreed and recorded it the next night. The chemistry in the studio was electric, and everyone was in awe of Elvis's performance. Chips wanted Elvis to hear a song called Suspicious Minds, which he thought was perfect for him. When Chips played it, Elvis liked it and wanted to hold on to it. However, Freddie Bienstock and Tom Diskin from Hill and Range tried to claim part of the publishing rights. Chips was furious and threatened to end the session. I suggested he talk to Elvis privately, and Chips did. Elvis agreed to let Mark James keep the publishing rights, and the session continued. By the last scheduled session, Suspicious Minds hadn't been recorded yet. I was nervous and talked to Joe Esposito about it. We went to Elvis and reminded him about the song. Elvis snapped his fingers and said, "Let's cut that thing right now." Elvis recorded Suspicious Minds, and it became one of his biggest hits. The American Sound Studio sessions were a turning point in Elvis's career, and the magic was back. Chips got really excited when Elvis decided to do Suspicious Minds as the last song at the recording sessions. The musicians knew the song from working with Mark James, so they got into it right away. Elvis spent time tweaking the lyrics, and after just a few tries, everyone agreed the song was perfect. They played it back, and the studio erupted in cheers. It was a magical moment, with Elvis giving an incredible performance. High fives were exchanged, and Chips told Elvis, "We cut some fine songs here, but this one tops them all." After the recording sessions, Elvis had a packed schedule. He flew to Los Angeles to film his last movie, Change of Habit, with Mary Tyler Moore. Then he started preparing for his comeback to live performances with a 4-week gig at the Las Vegas International Hotel. The public's reaction to In the Ghetto, which hit number 3 on the charts, proved that Elvis was back and as popular as ever. The success of the TV special also showed Elvis that he still had a strong connection with his fans, both old and new. I continued writing songs with Mark James. We came up with Loving You's a Natural Thing, and thought it would be perfect for Petula Clark, who was known for hits like Downtown. But when we played it for Chips, he wanted to hold on to it. He had just signed a new artist named Ronnie Millsap, and thought the song could help launch his career. Ronnie recorded it, but it didn't become a big hit. Still, it was a close call for me, and I occasionally get a small royalty check for it. Elvis's return to live performances was a moment I'll never forget. I was supposed to be at his debut show on July 31st, but Elvis asked me to come the next night, saying it would be the first real show. From the moment he opened with blue suede shoes to the energetic, Suspicious Minds, I was in awe. Elvis looked amazing in his white karate-style suit, and his voice was as powerful as ever. He was all over the stage, doing karate moves and rolling on the floor. The band was incredible, with James Burton on guitar, Jerry Sheff on bass, and Ronnie Tutt on drums. Sam Phillips had advised Elvis to keep the rhythm section close, and it paid off. The show was electric, and Elvis was having the time of his life. After the Las Vegas shows, Suspicious Minds became a #1 hit. The song had a new ending, with Elvis stretching it out and repeating the first lines, which was a hit with his Vegas audience. Producer Felton Jarvis added some horn parts, and adjusted the volume to create the dramatic ending. Despite the song's success, there was tension between Chips Moman, the Colonel, and RCA. Chips's name wasn't initially on the credits, and the Colonel tried to minimize his role in Elvis's comeback. This strained the relationships between everyone involved, and Elvis never recorded at American again. Suspicious Minds would be Elvis's last #1 record. Elvis returned to the Las Vegas International in January 1970 for more shows. He started wearing the famous one-piece jumpsuits designed by Bill Ballou, which allowed him to be as active as he wanted on stage. The Colonel was in his element in Vegas, but he also had a fondness for gambling. One night, Elvis tried to be a blackjack dealer, but he didn't know the rules and ended up giving away a lot of money. The casino managers quickly put a stop to it. In Memphis, Elvis had the family life he'd always wanted. He and Priscilla were devoted to each other, and their daughter, Lisa Marie. In Las Vegas, he was back to being the world's greatest entertainer. The next logical step was to take his act on the road. The Colonel arranged for Elvis to perform at the Houston Astrodome, which was being called the 8th wonder of the world. The first show wasn't great because of the poor acoustics and empty seats, but by the evening the venue was packed, and Elvis set new attendance records. In the summer of 1970, Elvis had another successful run at the International, which was filmed for the documentary That's the Way It Is. Elvis surprised everyone by stepping into the audience during one of the shows. He walked through the crowd, shaking hands and kissing faces. It was a spontaneous moment that showed how much he loved his fans. Later, Elvis received a death threat, which turned out to be a hoax. To show his gratitude, he had Priscilla pick out gold bracelets for his friends, each with a nickname. Mine said Rockin' 50s, and Elvis's said Crazy. It was a reminder that we were all ready for the good times to roll again. Elvis was ready to take his act on the road after his successful shows in Vegas and the Astrodome. The Colonel set up a 6-city tour to test a new partnership with 2 young promoters, Jerry Weintraub and Tom Hewlett. I knew Tom from his work with acts like Creedence Clearwater Revival and Three Dog Night, and I was confident he'd deliver top-notch productions for Elvis. I really wanted to go on this tour, so I came up with an idea to file live concert reports for WHBQ, my radio station. Elvis and WHBQ loved the idea, so I was back on the road. The second show was at St. Louis' Kiel Auditorium, where we met Tom Hewlett. He insisted on a state-of-the-art sound system, which was a big deal for Elvis. It was the first time Elvis could really hear himself and the band, and he was thrilled. From then on, a great sound system became a must for every show. Elvis was like a kid on the road, full of energy and excitement. He and I were sitting on a plane when he asked me if I got nervous before my TV show. I told him I was always running around until the last minute, which kept me from getting too nervous. Elvis said he liked that nervous energy because it kept him from being too relaxed and losing his edge. He'd arrive at the venue just in time, spend a few minutes in his dressing room, and then hit the stage with all his nervous energy. Offstage, we partied like the old days, but it was different now that many of us were committed to wives or girlfriends. In Tampa, some guys picked up a couple of girls who were big Elvis fans and willing to do just about anything for cash. They set up a show in a hotel room, and Elvis directed the girls like a movie director. Elvis's dad, Vernon, showed up looking for Elvis, and I had to tell him what was going on. Vernon ended up staying for the entire show. On one of the last flights, I was sitting next to a young LAPD officer who had joined us for extra security. He told me a wild story about an undercover drug bust at Hollywood High School. The officer had worn a gold lightning bolt necklace, a symbol of the West Coast Mafia, which helped him identify the drug dealers. Elvis loved the story and was especially interested in the lightning bolt. Later, he gave me a necklace with the lightning bolt and the words "Tisby, taken care of business" written across it. It was a special gift from him and Priscilla. Barbara, the girl I'd been with for a decade, had gotten seriously ill and was in the hospital. Elvis kept asking me when we were going to get married. He even offered to pay for the entire wedding and be my best man. Barbara and I were touched by his offer and decided to get married. Elvis arranged for us to have the ceremony in his VIP suite at the International Hotel in Las Vegas. He invited all our friends, and we had a beautiful, intimate wedding. Charlie Hodge even played "Here Comes the Bride" on the piano, though he had to fake it a bit. The reception was a blast, and Elvis seemed as happy as we were. He gave us a matching pair of gold-plated Derringer handguns as a wedding gift, which made for some funny jokes. I even convinced Elvis to pose for a photo with his gun to my head, a playful nod to a shotgun wedding. Back in Memphis, my life didn't change much, except that Barbara moved in with me. Elvis and the guys loved teasing me about being a married man, especially when Priscilla asked if I'd had any strange lately. It was all in good fun, and I couldn't help but blush. Elvis was busy after our wedding. He got into an argument with his dad and Priscilla over his spending habits, and took off on a wild, lost weekend. He ended up in Washington, D.C., where he wrote a letter to President Nixon and delivered it to the White House. To everyone's surprise, Elvis and his friends ended up meeting President Nixon in the Oval Office, and Elvis got the federal drug enforcement badge he wanted. Elvis was always full of surprises, and no matter what happened, he was always there for us. By Christmas Eve, Elvis was back in Memphis, his usual high spirits lighting up the holiday. He was especially excited to shower little Lisa Marie with Christmas toys and gifts. Barbara and I were thrilled to spend a late Christmas Eve with Elvis and Priscilla at Graceland. After a while, we all decided to go for a ride to look at the Christmas lights around the city, just like we had in years past. But this year, Elvis had a different idea. When we had seen all the best decorations Memphis had to offer, he suggested one more stop, the Shelby County Jail. I thought it was better than his old habit of visiting funeral homes in the middle of the night. We pulled up to the jail and walked in through the back door. A sergeant at the main desk looked up and without missing a beat asked, "Elvis, what are you doing here?" "Nothing else is open on Christmas Eve, so we thought we'd come visit you guys," Elvis replied with a grin. The cops on duty were thrilled and gathered around us. We talked for a while, and then Elvis asked if it was okay to visit the prisoners to wish them a Merry Christmas. They got the okay, though the women weren't allowed back in the cell area with us. I didn't like being near those cell doors, but Elvis was relaxed and even happier than he'd been opening presents. We started walking down a long corridor, and the guys in their cells started cheering. "Hey Elvis! Merry Christmas, Elvis! Elvis, can I have a Cadillac? Elvis, will you be my lawyer?" Elvis was laughing and shaking hands with the inmates through the bars. When someone asked if he'd sing a Christmas song, he broke into a goofy version of White Christmas that they loved. As we moved down the corridor, another voice rang out, "George Klein." I was surprised to hear someone call for me instead of Elvis. The voice continued, "Hume's High, Elvis, it's me, Harold Poole." It was Harold Poole, a former Hume student known for being one of the most arrested men in Memphis. He had been a few years ahead of us in school, but everyone in North Memphis knew Harold. "Awa, Harold," said Elvis, "what are you doing here?" "Well, I got in a little barroom fight, Elvis, that's all. But Elvis, could you please help get me out of here?" "Well, you've got to behave yourself, Harold." "I will, Elvis, I will." "George, go tell the guys out front that I'll put up Harold's bond, and they can let him out." I went to tell the officers, and they said Harold couldn't be processed out that night, but would be released in the morning. I went back to Elvis with the news. Elvis went back to Harold's cell. "You're settled up, Harold. They'll let you out in the morning. You can be home for Christmas." "Thank you, Elvis, and God bless you," said Harold. I know that was one of the most appreciated Christmas gifts Elvis ever gave, and I think it was one of the ones he most enjoyed giving. In January 1971, Elvis received an honor that meant a lot to him. The National Junior Chambers of Commerce, the JCs, named him one of the top 10 outstanding young Americans of the year. Previous honorees included Leonard Bernstein, Orson Welles, Jesse Jackson, and Richard Nixon. Elvis was often offered awards, and the colonel was usually suspicious, thinking the organizations just wanted Elvis for publicity. But Elvis was moved by the JC's recognition, and agreed to accept it in person at an event in Ellis Auditorium. He also attended the honorees' breakfast at the Rivermont Hotel in Memphis. Elvis had to speak at the event, and he was nervous about it. On stage, he was a natural, but public speaking was different. Despite his nerves, he gave heartfelt remarks, saying that as a child, he was a dreamer who imagined himself as the hero of comic book stories. Now, he said, all his dreams had come true 100 times over. He ended with lyrics from Without a Song. "Without a song, the day would never end without a song. A man ain't got no friend, so I keep singing a song." In the early 70s, Elvis was still the strongest guy I knew. He was a workhorse who never seemed to get run down by his busy schedule. He was in the best physical shape of his life, and happy about his career. However, there were whispers about the high number of prescription pills he was taking for various physical ailments. Dr. Nick oversaw his care in Memphis, but there were other doctors in Los Angeles and Las Vegas who seemed to prescribe for Elvis just to say they had him as a patient. Looking back, I realize it took me a long time to understand how big a part those pills were becoming in Elvis's routine. He always made a point of not taking them or talking about them around me. I've thought about this a lot over the years. For all the things we shared, he must have made a conscious effort to keep that part of his life separate from our friendship. One night, Elvis offered to share a non-prescription substance with me. While nobody in Elvis's group was a stoner, a few of them enjoyed smoking marijuana to relax. We were sitting in the den at Graceland when Elvis asked if I'd ever smoked pot. I hadn't, but I was curious. He offered to let me try it, and I agreed. We smoked a joint, and at first it didn't seem like much. Then it hit me. My head felt heavy, and everything around me seemed strange. My heart was racing, but time felt slow. I laughed at the idea of Graceland's new address, 3764 Elvis Presley Boulevard, and imagined what traffic reports might sound like. Dead dog found on Elvis Presley. It was a mix of euphoria and panic. The euphoria was nice, but the panic wasn't. I was worried about driving home. Back at Graceland the next night, I told Elvis about my experience. "Driving home last night, did it take a long time for the traffic lights to change?" he asked. "Shit, yeah, Elvis, I thought I was going crazy. And how fast did you drive home?" "I was worried I was going to get a speeding ticket. Then I saw I was going 25 miles an hour. Elvis laughed. "Weird stuff, ain't it, George? I don't like that feeling, Elvis." "Me neither," he said. That was the end of my pot-smoking career, and as far as I know, Elvis didn't smoke after that either. While Elvis continued to be a top draw in Las Vegas and at concert venues, I kept working on Talent Party. I was proud of the show for its mix of local and national acts. I still gave garage bands a chance and featured local high school kids. Sometimes, local talent went national, like Gail Stanton, who was crowned Miss Fraser high on my show, and later became a popular Playboy playmate. I was also proud that Talent Party was often ahead of the curve in booking up and coming stars. We featured artists like Otis Redding, The Zombies, Ray Charles, Chuck Berry, Stevie Wonder, Al Green, Isaac Hayes, and many others. My TV success led to more MC jobs at concerts. I remember a few quiet moments I spent with Jimi Hendrix backstage at the Mid-South Coliseum in 1970. I asked him about his wild stage antics, like lighting his guitar on fire. He said he was done with that, and wanted to focus on his music. I also asked about the crazy rumors about his drug use. He laughed and said none of them were true. He was a gentleman, and put on a phenomenal show that night. Despite the rumors, Jimmy did have his demons, and he died from an overdose of sleeping pills just 3 months later. One of the challenges of Talent Party was keeping it hip, as music and fashion changed. Sometimes I had to take emergency measures to prove to a hot act that they weren't stuck with a square host. When the Doobie Brothers were hesitant to perform because they thought the set looked too slick, I had the crew rip it apart. They loved it and did a great show. There were a couple of stars I couldn't get on the show no matter how nicely I asked, like Louis Armstrong and Aretha Franklin. But the only star I ever had a really negative experience with was soul singer Brook Benton. Elvis and I had met him in the late 50s at a a Goodwill review. Brook was an up-and-coming singer and songwriter, and he had a song called I Wanna Do Everything For You that Elvis and I both liked. I introduced Brook to Elvis, and Elvis said he'd cut any of Brook's songs that fit. Brook submitted a song called Don'tcha Think It's Time, which Elvis released as the B-side to Wear Your Ring Around My Neck. As far as I knew, it worked out well for everyone. Brook Benton was back on top in 1970 with his hit single Rainy Night in Georgia. I wanted to get him on my show, Talent Party, so I went backstage to talk to him. I thought reminding him of our connection might help. Come on, Brook, don't you remember me? I'm the guy who introduced you to Elvis Presley, I said, but he just said, fuck Elvis Presley. I was taken aback but quickly responded, no fuck Brook Benton. I walked away and never played his records again on my radio shows. While all this was happening, I was still doing my radio show for WHBQ. One day, I got a stalker named Crazy Betty. At first, she just called the station to request songs, but soon her calls became more frequent and personal. She started sending gifts like home-baked pies, which we threw away. One night, she called and said, I'm going to freeze you to death. When I asked her what she meant, she said, I'm going to put my radio in the attic. Crazy Betty found my home address and phone number. She started sending me long, rambling letters and calling me in the middle of the night. If I hung up, she'd call back over and over. I started leaving the phone off the hook, but she'd still be on the line in the morning. She even followed me around in her car, bumping into me at stoplights. One night, my landlady called to ask if she should let my aunt into my apartment. It was Crazy Betty. I finally contacted her husband, a Navy pilot, but he thought we had something going on. He was crazier than her. Eventually, she called to say her husband was being transferred, so she wouldn't be around anymore. I appreciated the courtesy call. One night, I parked at a closed gas station near my home. 2 girls called me over to their car. They said they liked my show and asked if I'd sit with them. I got in, but they pounced on me, tearing at my clothes. I didn't know if they really liked me or if it was a setup, but I got out fast and went home. Elvis returned to Las Vegas in 1971, and the International was now the Las Vegas Hilton. I joined him as much as I could. After his shows, we'd party in his suite. Elvis loved quoting movie lines. One night, he recited George C. Scott's speech from Patton word for word. It was impressive, and I wished he'd had a role like that in his own movies. One night, Elvis and I heard Bill Medley of the Righteous Brothers singing, You've Lost That Loving Feeling, in the lounge. Elvis led us onto the stage, said hi to Bill, and then we had to double back. Bill told his audience, "If that guy wants to come on the road with me, he's welcome to." Elvis felt bad and apologized to Bill. Bill said it was the happiest crowd he'd ever had. People lined up for his shows after that. Elvis had a complicated relationship with Priscilla. He could love the woman he left at home, while being devoted to the woman he was with. He had a romance with Barbara Lee, a starlet he met at a show. He also dated Joyce Bova, who worked in Washington, D.C. Some of the guys around Elvis were happy with one-night stands, but Elvis wanted someone to connect with and talk to. One night, Elvis's date was flirting with Jimmy Dean, who was headlining at the Desert Inn. Elvis put a small handgun to Jimmy's head and said, "Leave her alone." It was half playful, but the message was clear. I was on Elvis's fall 1971 tour. When Joyce Bova had to fly back to D.C., Elvis asked me to fly with her to make sure she got home okay. On the plane, she fell asleep on my shoulder. I knew I had to be careful, so I kept my hands on my knees and my head twisted away from her. I didn't want Elvis to think I made a move on her. Joyce had a great nap, but I had the most uncomfortable plane ride of my life. Elvis could be kind and generous. During a show in Boston, I was excited to be in the famous Boston Garden. After the show, we passed an old janitor who waved at Elvis. I told Elvis, and he stopped to introduce himself. The janitor loved Elvis's music, so Elvis asked me to get his name and address. He wanted RCA to send the janitor all his albums. I stayed behind and made sure it happened. Elvis had a forgiving nature. In 1955, Marty Robbins had covered "That's All Right, Mama" and beat Elvis on some pop charts. Marty had a new song, "You Gave Me a Mountain," and Elvis loved it. He made it a highlight of his set, pouring his heart into it. He also started singing "My Way," Frank Sinatra's signature song. I was skeptical, but Elvis made it his own. In February 1972, Elvis's engagement at the Hilton ended, and the big news was that Priscilla was leaving him. Elvis and I had been through a lot together, from the early days of his fame to the ups and downs of his personal life. We'd always had each other's backs. When I heard about Elvis and Priscilla's separation, it hit me hard. The last holiday at Graceland had been tense, even with the laughs we shared. Elvis's jokes had a new edge, and it was clear that he and Priscilla were just going through the motions. Despite their efforts to keep things normal, I could tell they had grown apart. Priscilla, once a beautiful and innocent girl, had matured into a woman who wanted more from life. I hoped she would find her path and be happy. Elvis, on the other hand, was struggling with the loneliness. He threw himself into his work, performing at Madison Square Garden and recording some of his best music. His new single, "Burning Love," was a hit, and he was excited about a new film project. But no matter how much he achieved, there was an emptiness that he couldn't fill. I knew Elvis well enough to understand that he wasn't just looking for casual dates. He wanted someone who could connect with him on a deeper level. When I introduced him to Linda Thompson, a smart and beautiful woman, they hit it off. Linda brought out a side of Elvis that was relaxed and playful. For a while, it seemed like they might have something special. But when Linda went on a family vacation, Elvis felt the loneliness again. One night, while I was hosting my TV show, Elvis called and asked me to find someone for him to meet. I thought of Sybil Shepherd, a model and actress who had appeared on my show a few times. She was beautiful and had a great sense of humor. When I asked her if she wanted to meet Elvis, she said yes. They spent the night at the Memphian Theater and later at Graceland, and it was clear that they had a connection. Sybil was one of the many women who helped Elvis feel less alone, even if it was just for a little while. During Elvis's Las Vegas performances, he met Chris Pfaffman, a fan who shared his interests in spirituality and deep conversations. They talked about the Bible and meditation, and Elvis wrote her a heartfelt note before she left. It was clear that Elvis valued more than just physical relationships. He wanted to connect on a spiritual level as well. Even though I tried to keep my TV and radio career separate from my friendship with Elvis, sometimes our paths crossed. One fall day, I went to Graceland to ask him to do a radio promotion for WHBQ. I was sure he wouldn't do it, but he surprised me with a birthday gift, a stunning ring with a green stone surrounded by diamonds. It was a reminder of our friendship and how much he cared. Elvis also started thinking about business opportunities. He wanted to invest in something that would bring in steady income. One idea he had was to get into cable TV. He was frustrated that local Memphis channels signed off at night, and he thought owning a cable system would let him watch TV whenever he wanted. It was a practical idea, and it showed that Elvis was always looking for ways to improve his life and his business. Through it all, Elvis remained a complex and caring person. He had his struggles, but he also had moments of joy and connection. I was grateful to be a part of his journey and to have a friend who always looked out for me, even when I was trying to do the same for him.